Okay, thanks everyone for joining us for this last seminar of the semester. So today we are welcoming Dr. Hale Tufan. And Dr. Hale Tufan is from Cornell, but she grew up in Turkey, then did her PhD at the Journey Center in the UK. At that time, working on plant pathogen molecular interaction. But then she shifted towards studying the science of plant breeding with like social gender lenses. So today she will talk about equitable crop improvement, gender equality and social inclusion, plant breeding, research project programs and institutions. Thank you, Kali, for coming.
Thank you, Kali. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. And it's exciting to be the last speaker of the semester. I like that. Everybody's relaxed, ready for the summer. So I'm going to take you through a lot of different things today. So more for exposure. So if there's any questions at the end, I hope we'll have enough time. Maybe a different topic than you're used to. So give you an outline. I'll start with some what I call reflexivity. So talking about who I am and what I bring to my work, because that's really important to recognize for all of us. So I'm going to model that by first starting with myself, and then talk about gender and agricultural development more broadly, look at equitable crop improvement, what could that look like, and then talk about our work in the lab. So I see a student-heavy audience. That's what I was hoping. So I added this slide because I wanted to say our thoughts of linear career trajectories don't always hold, right? And I think I'm a model of that, and I'm proud of that. So I'm just going to kind of lay it out. I won't go through everything, but I did my undergrad in biochemistry. And then I went to the John Innes Center. I did molecular plant pathogen interactions, very lab focused, really in the more basic research realm. And I got very frustrated and I wanted out of that kind of lab, right? And I realized I just didn't enjoy it as much as I thought. And I looked for applied research, agricultural research specifically, and international. So then I went and joined the CIMMYT ICARDA winter wheat breeding program in Turkey, where I'm from. I spent 2 years there basically at the same time did international development at the university attached to John Innes. So I was really exploring. And I think I tell this to students I mentor a lot too, take time, right? Don't rush through everything, take time to explore, because sometimes you just pivot and it's the best thing that ever happened. And then I was lucky enough to fast forward to work at Cornell, and really my career trajectory the last 10 years shifted from international ag research, very applied research, programmatic management, to now, as I would describe, more social science in relation to plant, right? So it's been a journey. And what really triggered that? Usually I include this slide because this is a question I get all the time. How do you go from being a molecular biologist to working on social science and gender, right? And it really was, and I was telling the story to the students yesterday, for those of you who heard it, it's a little repetitious, but it's when I found myself more interested in the lives of the people, well, the young women that the program in CIMMYT in Turkey was hiring to do casual labor and helping us with nursery preparation and crosses. I was really more interested in them than the seed that I was handling, right? And I thought, okay, I have to chase this. I have to really dig into this and explore this. So it was really that personal experience, that pivot. And what I like to tell students is really follow that passion. It may not be easy, but if there's something calling you and you're not sure how that looks, don't shy away from it, because sometimes it'll take you in directions you never expect. So I'm going to set the scene a little bit, knowing that this is something maybe you may not know about, and I'm going to give a 10,000-foot view on gender and agricultural development. This is a 4 or 5 decade long debate, so I can't summarize it short enough, but I want to kind of raise your awareness on different issues and why that matters for all of us. I can throw stats like this at you, and this is an argument that I find winning in an audience of plant breeders, numbers, right? Why do we care? It's usually quantitative. So for example, women, there's an education gap in terms of agricultural education as well. Women have less access to resources around education. Women hold a tiny percent of land globally. This is across all geographies, right? Land tenure is a huge issue for women's rights in ag. Finances, women have much less access to financial resources, technology. This can be fertilizer, this can be seed. And at the end of the day, this is FAO data, even though it says National Geographic. They came out with this big number a couple of years ago that was like, if women were more productive, they could, there was like a 20-30% yield loss, productivity loss, right? This is one argument. This is a way to, this is more the numbers. To say if we want to care about gender and agriculture, there's a real productivity argument that you can make. And so as a lot of development work has kind of happened around this, and this is from the Feed the Future, this was a big USAID initiative that no longer exists, but using the slides to look at women's empowerment. So if we think if there is this gap, if there is this kind of something to take care of, how do we do this? And they really look around different domains. How do we have women more involved in decision-making, control over resources, income, leadership, time use? This is very complex, right? So just to tell you that in the development world, in the gender and development world, there's been a ton of work around understanding what are the entry points for women's. And I realized as I talked about this, I should probably define, if you walk away with one concept that you remember, it should be women's empowerment. This is seminal work by Naila Kabir, who's a Bangladeshi UK economist who's at the London School of Economics. And in '99, she wrote this book that kind of created the whole field, right? She really shifted all the debates. And she defines women's empowerment as the process by which those who have been denied the ability to make strategic life choices acquire such an ability. Super simple definitions, okay? So we think of them in that way. Is there something I can't decide around? Is there something I can't do? I want to do, but I can't. If I gain that ability, that's empowerment in its basic sense. So we talk a lot about empowerment in gender and agriculture. So I just wanted to define that. And more recently, again, I'm doing a mini lecture here, but I think it summarizes the latest in the field right now. There have been a lot of scholars saying empowerment is great, but there's prior steps. And I like this because in a plant breeding audience, this resonates, and I'll give you examples to get you through it. Reaching women means you have equal number or you make sure women are represented. They're coming to your field day, right? That's reached. Now, if you come to your field day, that's great, but is there a benefit to them coming to your field day? So that's the next step, right? Reaching them is one thing. Then you have to think, when they do come to your field day, what do they get out of it? Is there a benefit to them? Do they learn something? Have they gained mobility? Have they gained something that they want to gain? Again, empowerment is maybe coming to the field day is the first time they've been able to access knowledge resources that they didn't have before, and now they can make decisions around a variety they couldn't do before, right? That comes into empowerment. Then they've shifted something in their lives. Transformation, and this is entering the literature a lot more, so you probably won't run into it, but if you do, this is where people are at the moment, and they're saying it's great to look at individuals, but we know that if we empower individual women in communities that are unsupportive, often that fails. There's backlash, they don't get supported. So now there's a lot of work around community level transformation, getting support for that normative shift. If women gain ability to do things they didn't do before, we need a supportive environment to do that in, right? Again, very high level, but just so you understand, it's not a simple one kind of question, one answer field. There's a lot of gray areas, a lot of contextual factors too. And I want to draw this as a last kind of concept to bring in. At the center of it all, the word empowerment contains the word power, because power, and if you look at a lot of gender and ag work, underlies systems of power, systems of inequality, underlie everything we see manifesting as inequalities, right? It's the lack of power, often the lack of power to have, you know, how am I perceived to be, who's kind of using their perceptions of me in a way to diminish my power, what kind of asset I have is linked to what kind of power I have, where I can go and how I can do that, right? So it's a lot of the scholarship nowadays talks about power a lot more, because we're realizing that underlies everything. Okay, to bring this all home, I love to use a tiny case study because I think it symbolizes everything I just talked about in a way. This is the work of Nozomi Karawazuka in Vietnam, working around kind of mechanization. Mechanization is a big topic that comes in gender and breeding, gender and agriculture. So she tells the story, and I'll put the narrative up and read it through, but basically the underlying intervention is the introduction of small tractors, right? So these are tiny tractors that you can use on small plots of land. The idea being drudgery and hard work can be reduced by mechanization, and you need smaller mechanical instruments to do that, right? So good intention, we bring in a small tractor. So she goes and does like an ethnography. She follows what happens when these tractors get introduced. And she tells the story that the two-wheel tractors, men perceive that their decision-making power is higher than their wives because culturally, they're the ones allowed to drive the tractor, okay? So you brought something into the system that only men, because of the cultural norms, can drive. While their wives cannot do that normatively. Tractors enable men not only to control some aspects of farming, now they can use this tractor to optimize their farming, but they also increase their mobility and symbolic power, right? So by one act of introducing one piece of mechanized, tractor, you can actually do harm. And this is something I come back to a lot. At least don't do harm, right? If we're bringing in something that's supposed to help people, check before you bring the tractor in, who can drive a tractor? What are the norms around that? What does that look like? So the very kind of tail end of all this work that's happened over 4 or 5 decades is now culminating, and you hear a lot around gender and agri-food systems. So instead of gender and agriculture, we hear a lot around gender and agri-food systems. Because there's increasing recognition of the interrelatedness of production, which is right here, right? We talk about ag production, but also the food environment and consumer behavior. And the latest scholars are kind of saying all those things we've been talking about, social norms that hold women back, access to resources, gendered policies, agency is the ability to kind of affect your own life outcomes, all systematically feed into each part of the agri-food system. So it's expanded to more systems thinking in recent years. And if anything, again, hopefully that you can walk away with, is that I hope you trust me to know in the literature, gender inequalities are pervasive in global agri-food systems. This is not a unique problem to any part of the world, right? It's pretty much even in Sweden. You see these issues pop up everywhere in the world. And I put books down here just in case those of you are interested. There's a million different articles, but there's kind of key works that summarize some of the thinking over time. Okay. So, great, we know there's a problem, quote unquote, right? There's these gender inequalities in the broader agri-food system. What does that have to do with crop improvement? How do we bring that down to this level? I use Rex here, and I wish you were here because I would say, hey, I use you all the time. So this is a quote I use because I think it's great. Plant breeding is the genetic improvement of plant for human benefit. And I love this because human benefit, right? So often when I'm talking to breeders, I think, who are these humans and what is benefit? Because those are the things that if we're not clear about, we can make assumptions. And those are the things that we can miss out on. So this is a great framing because you can start asking, okay, let's unpack the word human and let's unpack the word benefit. And what's happened in global crop improvement, plant breeding worlds, for those of you who maybe are not up to date with that, I'm just going to give you a quick download. About 10 years ago, this idea of demand-led breeding entered the scene. This is global crop improvement. You see this a little bit. And the idea is, in international ag development worlds, instead of developing varieties that are just productive, we need to be aware of where they're being used. What's the demand? What's the market? Okay? So the frame has shifted dramatically about 10 years ago. So this is the work of the Demand-Led Breeding Initiative, and they published this book. And then thereafter, the CG followed suit, really took over the whole paradigm. If you want, you can go look at all the literature, but just to summarize it, nowadays, this is the accepted, I would say, flow breeding pipeline. So first you start with a target segment or a market, and this is very new in international ag, okay? Because we never talked about markets before. We talked about people, right? So there's a shift saying you need to understand who's going to be adopting your variety, and then develop a product concept or a product profile, which is a prototype of a variety you're developing, and then go on and develop it. This is modeled almost 100% off big ag in the US. This is a paradigm that a lot of big companies use to develop maize varieties, for example. So they've taken it and adapted in some ways to global breeding. But in parallel, we're also seeing this, the Food and Agriculture Organization, just kind of the authoritative body, food and ag policy-wise, published the Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems report last year. And two things I want to draw your attention to is they say the design of technology should consider preferences and constraints of women. And we also see down here in the kind of latest iterations of plant breeding, the word design had not been there before. Okay, that signals to say there's an intentionality about how I design a variety, how I think about a variety. Okay. And to me, that matters because we don't often talk about plant breeding as a design process. Okay. Now we're gonna pivot pretty sharply, so pun intended, hold on to your seatbelts. Why does that matter? So this is my favorite subject, is the 50th percentile crash test dummy. And this guy matters because this crash test dummy underlies all car crash simulations globally. Okay, it's changing a little bit. And that matters because it's based on the average American man in the 1970s. It's a certain height, certain weight, and it's just the body that they use in crash simulations. That matters because if you look at the data, women are about 70% more likely to get injured in car crashes. And if you're pregnant or you're disabled, that goes on. So what that means is, scholars say, the default male. They call this the default male in gender and design literature. And there's been a ton written on this, not in agriculture, but outside of agriculture. If you're looking for an entry point book, this is a great one. It's called Invisible Women. She looks across all sorts of different fields and looks at how data bias, so the lack of women in all sorts of different fields, has led to detriment in design processes. And her favorite example, Carolina Criada Perez, she kind of hones in on this heart attack symptom one, just another example to show you that outside of ag, this stuff has happened for a while, right? There's a recognition of this. So if you look at kind of how doctors are trained in heart attack symptoms common to men and women are the ones we all know, right? There's this radiated pain, you know, the pressure, there's sweating. But then there's some symptoms that are particular to women, and those don't get taught. So again, what you see is women are more likely to die of heart attacks because they're not recognized. They're sent home. They're sent like, oh, just take some Tylenol, right? So again, the idea of the default male underlying symptoms of heart attack can have detriment. And the more recent thinking, this is the work of Ruha Benjamin in Princeton. There's been a lot of work around design, especially around AI. You've probably read it in the newspapers. It's a very hot topic. And I bring this up because she does some beautiful work in her multiple books that she writes. And she says that in reframing AI, for example, she calls it the new Jim Code, the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequalities that are promoted and perceived as more objective than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. What she's saying is, just because AI is perceived to be objective, doesn't mean it is, right? This cautionary tale. So she writes this beautiful writing just to show you that there's gender bias, huge racial bias, together in design, they kind of intersect in various different ways. And again, if you're curious, great website. I refer people to this all the time, called Gendered Innovations out of Stanford. They have very accessible case studies that they do this across tons of different fields and kind of break out the numbers. Okay, so why is this a problem? And for all of you in this room who are training to be scientists, who are already scientists, I'd like to make the point that we're not born scientists, right? We don't come out of our parents and say, I'm going to be a scientist at age 0. And Richard Lewontin kind of beautifully summarizes as saying, scientists do not begin like the scientists, but as social beings immersed in a family, state, productive structure, and they view nature through a lens that has been modeled by the social experience. What that means is we all are a product of our social upbringings. So all of the biases that we carry, we bring to our science, whether we know it or not, right? We are whole humans, and we can't separate our individual socialized beings from our scientific identities. That's the bottom line. And all the research shows this, right? So there's been a move towards accounting for gender differences, like I talked about the heart attack symptoms and so on. But there's also increasing recognition that people who, you know, kind of women and minorities in science innovate more readily, but are less recognized. Okay, so there's a lot more research coming out to say the people doing the research themselves are marginalized within research. So the way I look at it is thinking about who's doing the research and that the research subjects are also diverse together is just good science, right? We can't get out of it. It's just fundamentally important to what we do. So I'm going to give you 2 quick examples from plant breeding before I move on to our work. And this one I intentionally picked because it's a little bit older. It's the work of Ann Ferguson from 1994. This is already happening then, right? She tracks the example of a bean improvement project in Malawi. And she watches the breeding program as they do their work, that she kind of observes. And what she sees is before they're setting out to collect data from farmers, there's already an assumption that men farmers have more knowledge, okay, within the breeding program. And she doesn't kind of interfere, she goes and follows. And the knowledge of men farmers is superior than women farmers, so when they go out, who do they talk to? They talk to the men, right? So then she comes back and she traces it saying their decisions and their breeding ideas are shaped by who they talk to. This is a very simple example from very early on, already demonstrating there was an issue like 30 years ago almost. And this is 10 years later, and this is the work of Johanna Bergman-Lodden with Nerika rice in Uganda. And she does a similar thing where she traces what happens when a rice variety gets released into communities. And she finds that this new Nerika rice is very high yielding, breeders were crazy about it, they really wanted to release it. When it went into the field, it was very tasty to birds. So something they hadn't thought about was bird attacks, right? Well, guess who chases birds away? Women and children. So what was actually happening is the negative effect of that high yielding variety that was great in trials on station, actually on farm ended up taking kids out of school, right? And nobody adopted it because who wants to be chasing birds all day? So it underlied a lot of adoption decisions that the simple act of testing in the right environment could have given that information earlier on. I don't expect you to kind of see this whole thing, but if you want to remember the reference, this is probably the latest thinking in gender and breeding in terms of a framework. And I like to kind of present it because it brings a lot of things together. We talked about contextual factors, we talked about resources, and the inequalities of women in these spaces can translate to different trait preferences, so you can kind of understand that there are trait differences. But also how breeding decisions are made need to take into account some of these restrictions and barriers. So then they're saying new breeding products take these into account, they get fed into the pipeline, and they have an outcome that touches the lives of men in its purest sense. And I'm bringing this up not so you can understand the full framework and cycle, but just to say, this has been a hot topic for about 5 years. So a lot of thinking has gone into gender and breeding. There's literature out there. If you take some of the more recent examples, it'll cite the other ones too, so you can get a sense of the. But to end this section, before we go into actual examples, this is one of my favorite papers. And it's someone who critically looks at this work from the outside. So this is a scholar who critically looks at the act of science. And without going into the full quote here, basically the argument that they're making is this marketization of international ag research matters and can be detrimental. I'm going to come to the end here because they say which markets are made by whom and how in turn shape whose demand comes to matter, right? The decisions you make on which market segment you're targeting matters hugely. And markets themselves are constructed, right? They're not like, they don't just exist objectively out there. So just to say, in addition to the more practical frameworks around breeding, there's been a lot of critical work going on alongside it. It's really exciting. Okay, being aware of time here. Okay, so I'm going to jump in. I took the decision to give like exposure across different projects rather than going deep to one or two, right? So I'm happy to answer any questions after the seminar. If you're curious about any of them, this is more kind of a quick exposure round. So we are what we call the Equal Lab, and I'll break down why we call ourselves that and kind of frame our work in this way. So I talked to you about women's empowerment, gender equality, and change. The more recent collective kind of documentation in this space talks about change towards more equality at being multi-scalar. Okay, it's not enough to work on women as individuals. You have to think of their households, the dynamics within their household. You have to think of the communities that they're operating in. You have to think of the organizations they're interacting with and the macro environmental, political, national landscape, okay? So a lot of the recent literature says you can't just be here or here, you have to think across all of this, or at least know where you're sitting. That's scalar thing. And again, more recently and excitingly, there's been work around looking to see, sorry, I'm just gonna finish this, looking to see how agricultural innovations, and this is Chris Barrett, who's arguably the god of ag economics, kind of says it's not enough to think of innovations, you have to think of the context, the social context in which they're being released. And there's been really recent thinking around saying, you can have a variety and you can introduce it with a social innovation, right? Not just a technical innovation, but a social innovation to accompany it. And that in the literature is called socio-technical bundles. It's a big word for saying you have a variety, you may have an intervention or the social around the variety, and those two together are a more effective bundle than just the variety or just the social innovation. So this is the latest thinking around how can we be effective in interventions in ag development. So I like to think we're here, right? We're thinking about the innovations, our innovation of focus, our crop varieties and seed systems, but we're thinking of this multi-scalar change and where we sit in that. So we're really looking at crop improvement projects, programs, and institutions, again, signaling the scalar, but looking at gender equality and social inclusion. So just to set the scene a little bit, we did a lot of work around how we work together. We think a lot about how we work together, and we borrow from feminist research praxis, which is a whole set of literature itself. And all the work we do is inter-transdisciplinary. We don't work within one discipline because we can't, the complex questions that we're answering. And we spend a lot of time around our core values and how we interact with them, because that makes our lab kind of function better. And everybody's happier. We're pretty crop agnostic. It's more opportunistic, where we have partnerships, where the grants are. We don't breed anything. We support breeding programs, so we don't have to kind of be constrained by that. These are some of the crops and areas that we work in collectively. So I'm going to start from the bottom and work my way up and give you some quick examples. Probably for about 10 years, a lot of the work that we did was around trait preferences from individuals, and this is the work that I did with the Next Gen Cassava Project, followed by RTD Foods. These are all large Gates Foundation funded projects around root and tuber crops and their breeding. So we did a lot of social science with them to kind of tease apart trait preferences. This is a heat map from Nigeria, from cassava. We have women and men from different regions, from poor, non-poor, food secure and insecure households. All that it's saying is, instead of saying what do women want and what do men want, we're really breaking that down to a granular level that programs can respond to that. I'm not going to give any more on this one. There's a ton of publications, so I can kind of refer you to those. What I'm really excited about is the more recent stuff. So I'm going to bring some of this up. I'm very excited to do more intra-household work. That's a very specific economic terminology, so I'll explain it a little bit. It simply means individuals within a household, right? This could be spousal couples, it could be their children, it could be their in-laws, it could be whoever's within a defined household. And a lot of the research shows us that gender inequalities are perpetuated within the household and outside, right? So it's very important to look within the household. So more recent work we're doing is around the household. I'm just showing you some raw data here because I think it's interesting. This is the work of a master's student. These are all the variables we collected together with the Senegal program, Isra Bame, and we're looking at cowpea in Senegal. This was the project that we were working on. Basically what we do is across 500 households, we collect all these variables up here, which are more household level variables, cowpea association, land size. And then we looked at decision-making variables. That means we asked husbands and wives reciprocally, who has the most knowledge, who puts time into cowpeas, who's in control of inputs, and so on and so forth. So we get a sense of how the couples see each other, right? Who's making decisions? And then we use pretty classic PCA methodology to cluster them into different clusters, okay? So I'm just going to show you numbers. It's just a messy back end. And basically what we're finding is there are different clusters. These are, call them typologies. Some of the literature talks about typologies. These are types of households, okay? For example, a cluster of households are falling into younger cowpea farmers, but the couples disagree with each other more often than not, right? One particular type of household. Second cluster was more polygamous, and the wife's time commitment was acknowledged by her husband and herself, but all the other domains where the wife said she had decision-making, the husband disagreed. Okay, so on and so forth. So we're pulling out these patterns. Third cluster, higher education, there's more agreement on life's experience, work is bolder, more market oriented, so on and so forth. So what do we do with this? So first we model the types of households, and that's just not their resources, but also their decision-making patterns. And then we look to see how their trait preferences change. And this hypothesis is, if you're in a certain type of household with a certain decision-making pattern, what does that do to what kind of traits you care about? And there's too much here for you to pull apart. But what I think is interesting is these are the husband's traits preferences, these are the wives for across the clusters. What's interesting thing is the younger and kind of where the women are, I would say, more disempowered because they're not recognized in their contribution, they're going for the yield. So what you're seeing here is higher is how much they care about that trait particularly. It's a particular methodology from econ called willingness to pay. So I'm not going to unpack that, but higher is better. So the husbands have an even distribution over the traits we were looking at, the wives are just in yield. And as you get more, empowerment is the wrong word maybe, but more recognition of women's role in cow feed production, the more they're pulling up market-oriented traits. So this is really interesting because we're looking to say, okay, when you look at the literature, you can't just say, I'm going to breed for yield, I'm going to breed for large seed size, because across those different households, those will matter or not very different. Again, breeders don't like to see this because they say, you're going to drive me crazy, there's too much here, what do I focus on? So then we work with them to really distill the lessons, right? But this is just a model, the kind of work that we're doing, merging the social science with the trait work. The other kind of big household related work that we're doing is in Costa Rica around beans. This is Costa Rica. These are the test sites in the north and the south that we work in, major bean growing regions of the north and the south. And these are just kind of labels of bean varieties that have been released over the years. They're most popular. And we got into this business really with the INTA, this is the national program in Costa Rica, and Luis Sanchez, who's working in our lab, is kind of from INTA, doing his PhD with us, going back to INTA, so it's a nice kind of sandwich arrangement. The idea was the readers wanted to know what was being adopted, and we were asking, well, who's adopting, right? So we really came together and spent so much time developing this method. And this is really testament to how important methods can be. And one of you asked yesterday at lunch, what do the methods look like? This is what they look like. So modeling a little bit of that here. So the literature often, so take a step back, DNA fingerprinting is the go-to adoption tool right now in a lot of the global ag world. What does that mean? You walk into a field, you take a bit of leaf, you go home, you genotype it, you say that's the variety that's being. Unfortunately, in a lot of the literature, they don't even mention how they select the fields. They literally just go and take leaves. Okay, so we're pushing back against that a little bit, saying, how can you do that? It's like adoption at a landscape level, but you don't understand how the social context is interacting with adoption. So we set out this experiment where we had a control sample. That just means there's a list of growers, which is the normal bean grower list in Costa Rica that everyone uses. We go to whoever's on the list and we have them take us to the plot and take us. That's the default methodology. And then we said, well, let's play with this a little bit, and we have what's called a treatment. We went to the sample person and we said, who else in this household works on beans? Okay. And we have 2 people. This is where the intra-household comes in. And we did surveys with both of them, with both members. And basically we developed what we're calling an index knowledge or information index, where this was developed by the breeders, by extension agents, by farmers to kind of understand what does knowledge on beans look like in an applied, like in a farmer perspective. And it was around, very simple, you know, how many seeds were harvested, specific amount of seeds planted in a hole, when the variety was planted, and all this information. We go and do this and we say, if the person on the list was chosen, we go with them anyway. If the other person was chosen, we go with them. So this is to say, we're not just blindly taking a person from the list, we're asking who knows most. And sometimes that's not the person on the list. That's where it becomes interesting. And the idea there is we use kind of basic Sankey diagrams. This is what the farmers say they're growing. This is what we're getting from the genotyping, and we're relating it to each other. And we're looking to see how do those play out. And what we're finding generally is the knowledge intentional selection gives you a higher probability of matching the genotyping. Seems super simple, Nobody's shown it. So this idea that you can't just go with the person on the list, right? That's how systems exist. You have to think about it a little bit more. And sometimes those are the wives of the men who were on the list, and that's we're missing out on their knowledge. Okay, deep dive on methods, because I thought some of you were asking about this, so moving along. This is something I'd love to do, so I'm just flashing it again. Moving a little more into seed systems have been interesting. This is more community level now. We went from the household up. This is a project in Tanzania looking at how do you build seed systems to be intentionally inclusive of women and young people, because a lot of the seed systems interventions globally miss out on women. And what we're doing here, and I'm just going to flash these up, is thinking about the same paradigm I showed you earlier. Instead of just reaching women in seed systems, we're doing a ton of work at the community level. We're doing community cooking days. We're doing training around gender-based violence, around land rights, around kind of engaging the women who were engaging to be seed producers and hoping that we have a more lasting legacy than just giving them seeds to produce. That their possibilities and their daughters' possibilities in the communities are changing. So we use different methods, like this is gender action learning methodology, very qualitative. You work with communities to map their perceived inequalities in their communities and interventions that can help them. It's very participatory, very field level. Just on time. I'm going to flash this work because I'm super excited about it, but I won't give you more than kind of that it's happening. This is the work of a PhD student, Emma Harity. She's starting this work around cacao conservation in Costa Rica, and it really came about through a relationship again with INTA. The bottom line is we're curious to see how matrilineal indigenous communities, these are the Cavacata and Bribri in the kind of Talamanca Pacific facing coast in Costa Rica. They have agroforestry systems that include cacao, and the diversity analyses that they do at the country level often miss out these communities. They don't even sample from the communities, and they shouldn't be sampling from the communities, right? So they're respecting kind of the internal indigenous communities, not wanting a lot of researchers to come and take samples. But what's happening is we don't actually know how conservation is happening. And the matrilineality is really interesting because seed can be passed on or trees can be conserved within the social structure from daughters to mothers, mothers to daughter and so on. So she's doing a lot of groundwork now, engaging with the communities, engaging with the right actors to kind of set out a very participatory and co-creative work to try to understand the diversity of these cacao, these agroforestry systems. Very early stages. Two pieces of work, more at the organizational level, because I promised you organization. We have one piece of work that's coming out soon, looking at how management and leadership. There's a lot of literature, management and leadership scholars over the years have generated a lot of academic literature saying that what we perceive to be good management and good leadership is often very male, right? All the attributes that we value that are valued in society. So we took that and we said, well, what's happening in our own projects? So we interviewed our own project participants, and it was very interesting to find a mirroring of that exact, right? Someone who is aggressive, someone who is loud, someone who is a go-getter, and all of these kind of anecdotes that you see. So that's kind of a drawing attention to the internal dynamics and teams that we have. And a PhD student, Quinn Johnson, did actually interviews with plant breeding faculty in the US to understand who does the care work. So that's really interesting as well. There's an imbalance in care work, even if both couples are professional faculty. So we're mirroring a lot of what's known, but what I'm excited about is this is in our communities, right? It's not othering, it's saying we're doing this right now actively in our lives and in our work. Two last things. Power we talked about. This is a piece of work that we did for the Innovation Lab for Crop Improvement. It's a multinational, multi-crop USAID funded project that's since stopped as of February. And this was exciting because we looked at how social scientists and breeders interact with one another across domains of power, which I won't go into. But it's just really interesting because some of this stuff had been drawn out 30 years ago in different publications, and we're still seeing it. In interdisciplinary projects where you have social scientists and breeders working together, breeders still feel like they're in charge. and social scientists feel like they're being invited in. And that causes a lot of friction, okay? Because social scientists don't feel like they belong, that they're shut out of some decision-making. There's a lot of closed room discussions. And there's a lot of transnational dynamics that what donors want is what should happen, even when they're working in development, right? But this is Beth Cullen and our publication around that, if you're interested to look at it. But this was nice in a way because we use this as a communication tool back to the project. This was very uncomfortable because the very people we interviewed were the very people we were interacting with. So then we presented it back to them. And just, you can come talk to me and how you do this work of introspection and looking at ourselves and then having those hard conversations, right? Some people just ignored it entirely because it was a hard thing to see, right? This is the work of another PhD student, Esther Obafuncho, that I'm very, very excited about. She is Nigerian. She worked in the extension program in Nigeria. She's doing this beautiful work that draws from African philosophy, history, and science and technology studies to trace how crop breeding has taken a trajectory over time from pre-colonial to independence to post-colonial to say, what did breeding look like, right, in Nigeria for one crop. Super fascinating because she's pulling out kind of how our current practices are inherited from historical decisions. And it's not often that you kind of do that kind of deep dive. So I'm really excited to see what she's coming up with. And lastly, this is work that we did more at the landscape level, looking across 50 years of data at kind of trait preference data. And what we found, again, at the macro environmental level, only 20% to 30% of studies report any women in their sample, right? So this is going all the way back to one of the first slides where I said the data blindness is real in the work that we do. So this was like a scoping review that we did. And to say that there's a lot of donors that drive this, like donor power and kind of how consolidated that is driving some of these patterns. Okay, we'll leave spend time for questions. So I'm just gonna end on this. I hope that you can walk away that gender equality is complex, pervasive, but we really need to think about it and work across disciplines to kind of make any headway. For me, our most recent work is around methods because there's just not a lot out there to be able to do this kind of transdisciplinary work. And some of the reflective pieces, I hope you walked away with being inside and outside and doing that work can be difficult, but it's very necessary. And the bottom line is just releasing a variety with ignoring the context just doesn't work. Like there's enough recognition that that's happening. And for a brief plug, when you do something once and you never do it again, never edit a book. People told me this and I did it anyway, and now I'm like, never edit a book. So we've got this great book. It's got some interesting chapters in it that you may be interested in. It just came out last year. So trying to shift away from not talking about power to really talking about it in all the spaces. So with that, thank you.
Not yet.
How do you deal with reproducibility in these types of experiments? When is it just a snapshot of time, or how do you correlate that between cultures? And
that's a fundamental feud in social sciences between the qualitative and quantitative methods. This has been going on for before we entered this field. So for those of you not familiar, quantitative methods are all your economics, your surveys, your large N studies, right? Qualitative research itself is more anthropology, qualitative social science, where you do interviews, observation, ethnographic work. Those are not supposed to be reproduced. The idea is that they give you a snapshot of that particular condition. It may or may not be representative, but it explains the patterns, right? So like looking at the patterns of the large N studies and then doing the interviews helps you explain. So when you're doing qualitative work, you never look for reproducibility. You look for that particular experience and what that's telling you. And sometimes you do what's called grounded theory, where you go to the field without any pre-assumptions. You watch, you learn, and then you theorize and say, this is what I think I'm seeing. So, but that's a problem because often breeders will be like, you're just talking to two farmers. I don't have to take your data seriously. And that's when you have to be like, actually, this is a field of study. Do you have anthropologist friends? This is what they do, right? This is a legitimate academic field with its own methods, its own standards, and super robust. Like, it's not just going to talk to people. It takes more time to develop a qualitative tool than it does to develop a quantitative. Like, lived experience, super hard. So I think this is my mission, to educate people on that and really be an ambassador for qualitative methods, because they're overlooked and undervalued because of the assumption of, can we repeat it? Is it scalable? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
How do you personally deal with the sense of anger, or when you go and say these gender
Not
inequality?
anger. Oh, that's such a one close to my heart. I guess one thing that I recommend to people is community. I have my support structures in very different ways. I have groups of scholars that we support each other. I have personal friends. So it's just finding community that you can go back to and just release. So like with a few people in Ithaca who are also feminist scholars, we meet regularly and it's just cathartic to just then you feel better and you go on, right? So definitely lean on other people. Community is the one thing that helps. The other one is maybe more particular to me, but when I feel someone is not convinced or they're challenging, I like to lean into that, because I'm like, okay, this is really important, right? So instead of being deterred, I tend to kind of lean into those challenges. And over the years, it's actually paid off, right? The people who are most like, no, this doesn't matter. Over time, I've seen them slowly come around. That's been really rewarding enough now where I particularly kind of focus on people. If it turns toxic, I avoid. But if there's any glimmer of like they're curious, then it's actually really rewarding. So yeah, not easy. Chocolate, maybe that's a simpler answer. Yeah.
In the studies you've done of your own groups and collaborations, have there then been interventions and follow-ups? Have you been able to change things, and what does that look like?
Such a good question. So the one where the power one, we actually wrote the paper, we presented it back. And some people were very excited about it. The people who I was hoping to influence just ignored it. And I found that as an avoidance mechanism, because it was very clear what we were saying. And they knew they were complicit in this. But again, take your wins. Like the people that did come to the table was really nice. So they took the message, they saw, they heard, we had great discussions. So not trying to change everyone, but identifying who's ready for that conversation. We were also very careful. And the management leadership one that we're publishing now is going to be interesting too. It's completely anonymized. There is no signal on what project, what institution. We scrubbed everything. So only the people that know us and know the work we did will recognize it. So I'm excited to see when that comes out, how I can then talk to the people who are in there, right? We draw on something called, in science and technology studies, they call it feedback with care. So seeing the people taking your feedback as an act of care, saying like, this is something I'm seeing about what you're doing. And I want you to know that. And you take it or you leave it, but maybe you can do better. So it's kind of framed in that way. People take it more readily. Yeah. Not easy.
I would like to know if you get the first one, people that engage with the project. Bring them work.
Yeah.
And also, what is the outcome from the demand-led research that
That's a really good question. The demand-led research.
Repeat the
Oh, could you repeat do I have to repeat it for the?
You can just say it, it'll pick you up good if you want to repeat it again.
Okay, could you repeat the question, please?
If you could, just a little close, since,
Okay,
The
you
microphone is-
oh, you talked about the demand-led breeding initiative, and the first question is, how do you bring people? Yeah. Let me start with the second one. I don't have metrics on the effectiveness of the demand-led breeding program. What I can say, it completely shifted international crop improvement worlds. in that way, it was very impactful because it was the first time people were talking about people buying a variety or choosing a variety being an act of demand rather than we just magnanimously give varieties away, right? So it gave more agency to farmers in a way because they're the one demanding something. So it did shift something. The market intelligence, the CG made a big investment that they now they don't support anymore. So I don't know. It was a short-lived experiment, so it's hard to tell how much that changed. But there was a lot more funding going into this work than ever before. So that was a plus. At the farm level, I don't know. Was there kind of a farm level change from the demand-led breeding? Yeah, I don't think anyone's really done that impact study. How do you kind of bring people to the table and interested in the work? People interested kind of emerge usually. But in mainstream, I try to also do talks in more mainstream plant breeding fora where it's like sensitizing to these ideas, just so I can reach a bigger audience, really. There can be very strong resistance and that's real for sure. But I go in expecting it, so I'm not surprised by it. And again, I don't push the work, it's more whoever's interested, and especially with the national programs, it's more like them approaching us building something collaboratively. So it's never like we want to do this. It's more, what do you want to find out? How do we do this together? Which is much more fun. Thank you. Yeah.
Within your research, do you see a lot of differences when you're looking at like international studies of like developing countries versus studies that you're within the US where I feel like a lot of agriculture systems are very set in stone and this is how we do it, we're not changing it. And how we do.
I have a
kind of
slide for
different-
that. There was like, people may ask about the US context, so go back. The gender and ag research and scholarship is hugely developed internationally. There's so much more that we know than we know in the US, which is, I think, interesting. There's almost a sense of we don't need to be having these conversations. But people that do the research find exactly the opposite, right? There's a lot of scholarship emerging now. So I pulled out 3 papers. This is a good review. Women farmers in developed countries, a literature review, right? This is a great paper, Women, Race, and Place. They use the 2017 Ag Census data to look at patterns around, they're called farm operators in the US, not farmers. There's a really interesting shift. That's what this paper talks about. The USDA National Ag Survey changed the way they define farmer operators in their 2022, I think, 2023 survey. So all this is to say is there's work happening in the US. There's older scholarship than this, but the trends are very small, right? Women, people of color, indigenous farmers, smaller operation, less profitable, less aspects of resources, niche markets. It's like copy paste. You see very similar issues and topics. And the thing here is the intersection between gender and race comes out very strongly, especially in that pillar. So I don't do that research firsthand, but there's a lot of people who are working on it. Yeah. Thanks for telling me. I make it better. Okay.
Talk to the students a little bit more about, I know you've already talked a little bit about developing international collaborations. I think Cornell, like, opposed to here, has much more international ag work.
Right.
We don't really, the students don't really get that here. So could you talk a little bit more about getting into that type of?
I mean, timing is bad.
We can do that about everything.
Those of us in international ag will be in it much longer. So US universities, and I don't think Minnesota has one, but there's opportunity. Was like the US AID Innovation Labs were a really big opportunity for US based students. There were like 27 of them before they all shut down. That was a great way because US universities, they were PI'd in US universities, they're called innovation labs, and each had a topic. And then they would do only international, right? So many students went through that pipeline and they really got attached to those projects. So I guess for students, finding projects much harder now, but then that's how you would do it. You would kind of find those innovation labs in the US, who want to stay in the US and attach to them. I've seen a lot of students do that. If there's any internship, like the CG centers are still very great places to be a young scholar. I think once you get higher up, it becomes harder. Probably shouldn't say this on record, but I think it's still a great place to go and learn and experience. Really, I mean, there's many, I don't know if you all know about the CG centers, but there's a ton of them doing work in different crops. You're pretty well supported as a young scholar. I think those are great opportunities. So you may have to leave where you're at to get those experiences. I don't think they come to you very easily, so you kind of have to go out and do the work. But there are opportunities.
There is no more question. I think we can close it for today. Thank you.